Have you had a DNA test and it's not what you expected because something that you thought was going to be there was not there? Well, let's go over some of the reasons today. Howdy, welcome to Family History Fanatics, where we love helping you climb your family tree and have fun along the way. If you're new to genetic genealogy, chances are you have lots of questions. Be sure to check out the link in the description below that contains our free guide to the 5 most common DNA questions we're asked. Usually this question comes up with a specific ethnic group, and probably the most common one that I have seen is about a Native American tribe or something with Native American, and that's really because a lot of the DNA tests that have happened have been by people in the United States, and there is a lot of mythology in the United States about an ancestor being Native American. So let's go over some of the reasons why a specific ethnicity result just wouldn't show up after you've had a DNA test. The first thing we need to understand is the reference population and what that reference population is. Now, to be a part of the reference population means that you have a family history that is from a specific region, and this has been confirmed through a paper trail. So the problem with this is that means there's got to be a set of records that really identifies your family having been in a certain location for a long period of time. Many cultures don't actually have written records, and this makes it a little bit difficult. Now, they get around this in some ways by assuming that certain indigenous populations have been there for many, many years, many generations. But that doesn't always account for any kind of intermixing that may have happened during that time period. So if we look at Ancestry DNA's reference population, they give us some facts about it. There's more than 44,000 samples in that reference population. Now that is still only about 0.2% of all of their DNA database. They have about 20 million samples in their DNA database. So it's not necessarily a very large part of it, but this is again what everything's being compared to, so it doesn't necessarily need to be as large as the database. They divide this up into 70 regions. Now, the population with the most samples of those 70 regions is actually indigenous Puerto Ricans with 4,791. And in fact, there are several places in the Caribbean that have a few thousand samples in their populations. Indigenous Cubans is another one, as well as some others. Now, this is because there were some studies done on these indigenous populations, in particular where a large number of DNA samples were taken from them. So to give you an idea, Puerto Rico as a whole is a population of about 3.5 million. But from the data that I gathered, the indigenous population of Puerto Rico only constitutes about 30 or 40,000. So having 4,700 plus samples in the database is really more than 10% of that indigenous population, which means that's going to be very representative of what the overall population looks like. On the other hand, the least number of samples in a population in the Ancestry database is the Burusho, which is a group in Pakistan. Now there's about 80 or 90,000 that are considered part of this ethnic group, and only 23 samples for this overall population. It's interesting, first off, that the population with the most still is only a population of about 40,000 people, and the population with the least is about 80,000 people. When you actually compare that to some other populations, so for instance, Russia and Eastern Europe, there's about 1,000 samples in the Ancestry database to represent Russia and Eastern Europe, and yet that covers about 200 million people. So even though there's quite a bit as far as a sample compared to many of the other groups and regions in the Ancestry database, because the population is just so large and so massive, it's probably not very representative. Another instance of that is the populations in China or India, where there may be a few hundred samples for that, but the populations that they're covering are 200, 300, maybe even 400 million people, that are supposed to be represented by that 250 sample. Depending on how big the overall population is, most of the regions don't really have enough samples in them to really be representative of everybody. And so it's actually not surprising that as people test, they might not have something like Russian or Scandinavian or something else that they thought they were going to have, simply because their populations of those places are large enough that even just a few hundred samples doesn't really cover the total variety of genetics within that group. Now, if we look at a map, it looks like in some cases there are really big regions. Now, part of that is the map projection. But when we start to look at the actual populations of many of these regions, they're actually really, really small. So for instance, if we're looking at the top of North America, there's one region that covers half of Canada and all of Alaska that is really the Inuit population. That's a small population. It is not millions of people. I believe it's just a 50 to 100,000. I'm not sure if it's even much more than 100,000. On the other hand, once you go over to Europe, and you can see that in the British Isles, there's actually divided up into 4 or 5 different groups, but each one has several million people in each one. And then with some place like Germany, it's not that there's one population there, it's actually that there's a half a dozen groups that actually overlap that in several different areas. Once we get down into Africa, a place like Nigeria that has a couple 100 million people doesn't have more than one group. And so this can be a problem in trying to identify really the real genetic diversity with everything. Ideally, we just test everybody and be able to have that diversity, but we really can't with 7 billion people. So let's ask the question to ourselves, well, how many different ethnic groups could there possibly be? Now I decided, well, let me use languages as a proxy for ethnic group. It's not really a perfect one, but languages develop over time, and usually with certain ethnic groups, they might have a unique language. Some languages obviously have gotten much more native speakers. Like English has, 500 million or so native speakers. Mandarin Chinese, upwards of 800 million native speakers. And some languages are more spread throughout the world than others. So it's not a perfect proxy, but it's a start. And there's about 7,000 languages that are spoken in the world today. So if we did some math here, and we said we need at least 23 people from each one of these 7,000 ethnic groups, that would mean we need a reference population database of 164,000. Now, Ancestry has the largest one at just over 44,000. I think 23andMe's, the latest information I had was there's about 12,000. But the majority of Ancestry's database also happens to be these Caribbean island studies where several thousand of the natives from each one of these islands were tested. And so their real overall global reach, if you take out those Caribbean island studies, is only about 20,000 or so. So none of the DNA companies are anywhere close to this minimum to actually have it spread throughout the whole world. Now, on the other hand, if we actually look at the database population that would be needed for this, we take that 164,000 and we divide it by the 0.2%, and we would need at least 82 million in the database. Now, Ancestry is about 20 million, so they're about 1/4 of the size of the database that you would need to even have this 164,000 reference population to cover all of these different ethnic groups. But that was the low end. Remember, that was just looking at the minimums. So let's look at the maximum. Let's take, again, that indigenous Puerto Rican where we have just 4,791 samples in it. Multiply that by our 7,000 different ethnic groups based on languages, and you have a reference population. Now, again, let me clarify, this is not the database size. This is just the reference population. You'd have to have a reference population of 34 million. Right now, if you combine all of the databases, 23andMe, Ancestry, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, and Living DNA, we're just really over about 34 million total samples for the total database. But you would need that many in the reference population to really have a good spread of the overall genetic diversity of all of these different groups. Now, in order to have that, then we've got to, again, do that math to figure out how big of a database population it is. And this is where it's key is only a small percentage of people actually qualify to be in that reference population. So the database population, doing the math, would need to be 16 billion with a B. 16 billion samples large, which is twice the population of the world right now. In other words, there's really no way we could get to that maximum to have that spread of unique people from each one of these cultures to be representative of the genetic diversity of that ethnicity. And so that is the reason why lots of people take a DNA test and they don't have some ethnic result that they were expecting. Many of these ethnic groups just don't exist. For instance, there's not a lot of diversity in the database populations for North American indigenous tribes. There is not a lot of genetic diversity for places like China and India, simply because there have not been that many people that have tested. Now, as testing grows, as we have more people, particularly outside of the United States, that test, and these are added to the populations, I would expect to see that places like northern India and northern China, where right now the region covers hundreds of millions of people, it will start to get divided up into smaller regions as the reference population for that starts to increase. But overall, I think there's always going to be some ethnic groups or some, specific subdivisions that just aren't going to be represented simply because they're too small, not enough people are testing from them, and there's not going to be enough information for a reference population to actually distinguish them from everybody else. Now, if you would like to learn more about reference populations, you can watch this video up here. But if you want something else about DNA, then check out this video down below.